In 1953, a factory worker's wife in Akron, Ohio, packed her husband's lunch pail the same way her own mother had packed it during the Depression. Bread, whatever the icebox had left, and nothing wasted. There was no deli case yet. No plastic wrap. No price sticker telling you a sandwich was worth $14. There was just a woman deciding what her family would survive on and doing it with more skill than any chef gets credit for today. 20 of those sandwiches. Some you'll remember. Some you were never supposed to. Number 20. Lard and salt sandwich on the tenant farms of Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle. In the dust years of 1933 through 1936, lard was rendered at home from whatever hog scraps a family had left, spread thick on bread, and finished with a pinch of salt. 900 calories in 2 slices of bread. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That dense, unglamorous fat is what kept a field hand upright through a 12-hour picking day on almost nothing else. Long before anyone was counting calories on purpose. Number 19. Mustard sandwich in the coal camps of West Virginia and western Pennsylvania. Between 1931 and 1935, a miner's lunch pail didn't always have meat in it. Some days it just had bread and a knife swipe of mustard, sharp and vinegar bright, meant to trick a tired mouth into thinking it had eaten something with flavor. A man could work a 10-hour shift underground on a sandwich like that, and he did, week after week, because a 50-cent paycheck didn't stretch to ham. This was not a snack. This was a wage earner making it to Friday, number 18 butter. And sugar sandwich nationwide. Through the worst Depression years, butter and sugar together on bread was called a dessert in front of the children, and understood as something else entirely by the parents. It was calories, plain and simple, dressed up sweet enough that a child wouldn't notice how thin the rest of the day's meals had gotten. That is not indulgence. That is a mother protecting her child from her own worry, one spoonful at a time. Number 17. Fried bologna sandwich. The smell hit you before you even walked into the kitchen. Bologna curling and browning in a cast-iron skillet, the edges going dark and crisp, the center staying soft and pink underneath. Factory towns across the Midwest and the Rust Belt through the 1950s. Bologna ran about 29 cents a pound at the corner grocer, and a woman could feed her husband's whole lunch pail crew for the week on it without blinking. Frying it, not just slapping it cold from the package, was the difference between a sandwich and a meal, and every wife in that neighborhood knew it. The mustard went on, while the bologna was still hot enough to make it sizzle faintly against the bread. This was not cheap food, even though it cost next to nothing. This was a wife making absolutely sure her husband had something warm in his stomach before an 8-hour shift, standing on a concrete factory floor. Some kitchens fried the edges until they curled up into a little cup, and the joke in the neighborhood was that you could crack an egg right into the middle of it and call that breakfast, too. Nobody was laughing at the food. They were laughing because it worked every single time on almost no money at all. Number 16. Onion sandwich on the tenant farms of the Midwest in the 1930s. A raw onion, sliced thin, laid on white bread with a smear of mayonnaise, was called a poor man's delicacy. And it was said with a straight face because the sting and the bite of that onion was the only spice a family had. No name-brand seasoning. No trip into town for something better. Just a root pulled from the ground that morning and a stomach that needed filling before noon. Number 15. Tomato sandwich with mayonnaise August in the rural South, somewhere between the 1940s and the 1950s. A tomato picked warm off the vine that morning, still holding the heat of the sun in its skin, sliced thick, salted, laid between 2 pieces of soft white bread spread edge to edge with mayonnaise. The juice ran down your wrist before you got the first bite in, and nobody minded, because that mess was proof you'd caught the tomato at its absolute peak. Grandma didn't measure the mayo. She just knew by feel and by years of doing it how much a tomato that good deserved. There was no recipe card for this. There was just a garden out back, a knife, and a woman who understood that the best ingredient in the kitchen sometimes needed almost nothing done to it at all. Today, a restaurant will call this an heirloom tomato tartine, plate it with microgreens and flaky salt, and charge you $14 for the privilege of eating what a backyard garden gave away for free every single summer. That is not innovation. That is a rebrand of something that was never broken in the first place. Back then, nobody needed a chef's name attached to a tomato sandwich for it to matter. It mattered because the garden had given everything it had that summer. And a woman with a knife and a jar of mayonnaise knew exactly how to honor that. Number 14. Sugar sandwich 2 slices of bread, a spoonful of sugar, pressed flat and folded closed. In Appalachia and the rural South through the 1930s, a loaf of bread ran about 7 cents, and sugar was one of the few things left in the pantry when everything else had run out. Mothers called it a treat. It kept a hungry child quiet, and a hungry child fed for 1 more hour before supper was ready. There was no butter to spare that week, no jam left in the jar, just sugar and bread, and a mother's good instincts about what would hold a stomach over. Grandma just called it getting through the afternoon. Number 13. Egg salad sandwich boiled eggs, mashed with a fork until the yolks broke down into a pale yellow paste, bound together with mayonnaise, spread thick between 2 slices of soft bread. In urban working-class kitchens through the 1930s and into the 1940s, eggs were one of the cheapest complete proteins a family could put on the table, and a nickel's worth of them, dressed simple with a little salt and pepper, could feed 4 mouths at lunchtime with room to spare. There was nothing fussy about it. No celery, no relish, no fancy seasoning most weeks, just egg, mayonnaise, and bread, because that was what worked and what the budget allowed. Nutritionists today will tell you an egg is one of the most efficient protein dollars on the entire planet, backed by studies and charts and careful measurement. Grandma just called it Tuesday, and she was right decades before anyone bothered to prove it with science. A dozen eggs cost around 13 cents in many parts of the country through the 1930s, and a single dozen, boiled and mashed, could carry a family through 2 or 3 lunches in a row without anyone complaining, because the bread underneath it was soft, the filling was cool and creamy, and it tasted like something had actually been made, not just assembled out of desperation. Number 12. Chipped beef on toast dried beef, shredded thin as paper, folded into a white flour gravy, and ladled hot over toast until the bread went soft and heavy underneath the weight of it. It showed up in Depression kitchens across the country through the 1930s, and it showed up again in military mess halls through the Second World War because it did one thing better than almost anything else a ration budget could manage. It turned a small amount of preserved meat into a dish that filled an entire plate and an entire stomach. Armour and Company had been canning dried beef since the late 1800s, and by the time rationing hit hard in the 1940s, that little glass jar was doing quiet, unglamorous work in kitchens that had nothing else to offer that night. Soldiers joked about it. Families depended on it. This was not a joke dish, no matter what the nickname implied. This was survival, wearing an ugly name so nobody had to say the word hunger out loud. A jar of dried beef ran only a handful of cents and never spoiled sitting on a pantry shelf, which mattered enormously in a house without reliable refrigeration. When the gravy thickened just right and the toast held its shape underneath it instead of collapsing into mush, that was a small daily victory, and every cook in that kitchen knew the difference between a gravy done right and one done in a hurry. Number 11. Braunschweiger sandwich German immigrant communities in Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis kept this one alive through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Liverwurst, spread thick on dark rye, topped with a slice of raw onion sharp enough to make your eyes water before the first bite even landed. Organ meat. The part of the animal nobody today wants to admit they need, sitting right there on a sandwich, a working family ate without a second thought, because it carried more iron, more B vitamins, more real nutrition than the cuts twice its price at the butcher counter. Nobody called it a superfood. Nobody needed to. It was just what liver did, and everybody's grandmother in that neighborhood knew it. They knew things about organ meat that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, mostly because a marketing department somewhere along the way decided liver simply wasn't appetizing enough to put a nice name on and sell. Butchers in those neighborhoods sold it cheap because most customers walked right past it, and the families who understood its value bought it every week without fail. Wrapped in wax paper, carried home for a sandwich that cost pennies and delivered more real nourishment than a cut of steak, most of those families could never have afforded anyway. Number 10. Salmon loaf sandwich canned salmon, cracker meal, and a beaten egg packed together into a loaf pan and baked until it held its shape firm enough to slice, then served cold the next day, pressed between two pieces of bread for lunch. Coastal towns and inland depression kitchens both relied on this through the 1930s, because a single can of salmon, stretched with crackers and egg the way Grandma knew to stretch it, could turn into a complete protein meal for a family of 5 without anyone going hungry. She didn't waste the bones either. Canned salmon bones, soft enough to mash right into the loaf, meant extra calcium nobody in that kitchen ever had to think twice about. This was not scraps thrown together out of desperation. This was a woman doing careful arithmetic with a can opener and getting the answer right every single time. A single can ran around 15 cents, and it kept in the pantry for months if it had to, which made it one of the few proteins a family could rely on even in weeks when the icebox held almost nothing else. Sliced cold the next day, pressed between bread, it traveled well in a lunch pail, too, holding its shape through a whole morning without falling apart. Number 9. Welsh rarebit sandwich in the coal mining towns of Pennsylvania, where Welsh immigrants had settled by the thousands, a sharp cheese sauce, thinned with a splash of ale and poured hot over toasted bread, was comfort brought straight over from the old country and kept alive because cheese and beer were two things a mining family could almost always get their hands on, even in the leanest years of the 1920s through the 1940s. The sauce had to be stirred constantly, low and slow, or it would break and turn grainy, and every woman in that community learned the trick from her own mother before her. It tasted like home for people who were a very long way from home, poured hot over bread on a cold Pennsylvania evening after a 12-hour shift underground. The cheese itself was usually whatever was cheapest and sharpest at the company store. Nothing fancy, but the ale cut through the richness just enough to keep it from feeling heavy, and the whole dish came together in one pan in under 15 minutes, which mattered enormously to a wife feeding a husband who walked through the door hungry and coated in coal dust. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1921, a company called the Taggart Baking Company introduced a soft, pillowy, machine-sliced white loaf and named it Wonder Bread. Within 2 decades, advertising campaigns had convinced an entire country that dense rye, coarse cornbread, and the home-baked immigrant loaves families had eaten for generations were something to be embarrassed by at the table. Soft and white became proper. Everything else quietly became poor. It wasn't an accident, and it was never really about taste. It was about shelf life, uniformity, and a factory's ability to sell the exact same loaf in every state in the country. at the cost of every regional bread that couldn't compete with a national advertising budget. That is not progress. That is the deliberate erasure of what real bread used to taste like, sold back to us decades later as an upgrade we should be grateful for. Number 8. Deviled ham sandwich, a little tin can with a small red devil printed on the label. Underwood had been making it since 1868, and by the Depression it was one of the cheapest ways to get real ham flavor onto a table that couldn't afford an actual ham roast. Spiced, ground fine, spread thin across a slice of bread, it fed working-class kitchens nationwide through the 1930s and into the 1940s on pennies a serving, and it kept doing that job long after the worst years had passed. Kids grew up thinking that little can with the devil on it was just what ham tasted like, because for a lot of families it was the only ham they knew. Today a bistro will take the exact same idea, call it a pork rillette, plate it on a wooden board with cornichons and a scatter of parsley, and charge $16 for it. This was not fine dining reinvented. This was a can that cost a dime, doing the same job it always did. Mothers kept a shelf of them in the pantry because they never spoiled and never needed the icebox, which made deviled ham one of the few proteins a family could count on, even in the leanest stretch of a bad month. Spread thin, it went further than anyone expected, and a single tin could stretch across lunch for 3 or 4 children without anyone walking away from the table still hungry. Number 7. Pimento cheese sandwich sharp cheddar, grated down soft, folded together with jarred pimentos, and just enough mayonnaise to bind it all into something spreadable, packed thick onto white bread. Across the Carolinas through the 1930s and 40s, this dish earned itself a nickname it still carries proudly today, the caviar of the South, and it earned that name honestly because it turned 2 cheap pantry staples into something a whole family looked forward to at lunch. Every household had its own version, its own ratio of sharp to mild, its own opinion about whether it belonged on white bread or crackers, and nobody wrote any of it down because everybody already knew. Grandma just called it what was left in the icebox that needed using. She was right. Everything she knew was right. It kept for days in a covered bowl in the icebox, which made it perfect for a family that needed lunch ready on demand, without cooking something fresh every single morning, and by the time it hit its 2nd or 3rd day, the flavors had settled together into something even better than when it started. Number 6. Apple butter sandwich in Pennsylvania Dutch country. Through the 1930s, 40s, and on into the 1950s, apple butter meant an entire day standing over a copper kettle in the yard, stirring cider and apples down slow for hours until they turned dark, thick, and sweet enough to spread like jam on a knife. One good harvest, preserved carefully in glass jars lined up in the cellar, could feed a family bread with something worth eating on it clear through the coldest months of winter. Neighbors traded jars back and forth, comparing whose batch had cooked down darkest and richest, spread thick on a slice of homemade bread, still slightly warm from the oven. If the timing was right, it wasn't dessert. It was an entire autumn, saved in a jar, doled out one sandwich at a time. The stirring itself was a whole day's labor, hours standing over that kettle in the cold while the mixture reduced down slow, and children took turns at the paddle because a batch left unattended would scorch on the bottom and ruin the whole pot. Nobody complained about the work. A cellar full of jars by November meant a family wouldn't go without through February. Number 5. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich in the rural South of the 1930s. Peanut butter, a small tin running about 10 cents once it became more widely available in the years after the Depression's worst stretch, was mixed not with jelly, but with mayonnaise, spread across white bread for a lunch that stretched a family's protein budget further than a slice of meat ever could have managed. The mayonnaise cut through the thick, dry pull of the peanut butter and made the whole sandwich easier to get down on a hot afternoon. This was not the sandwich you grew up thinking of. This was the original version, built for protein and calories first, long before sugar, jelly, and clever marketing rewrote it into something sweeter, softer, and far less honest about why the combination existed in the first place. A field hand or a mill worker could eat that sandwich at noon and still have the energy to finish out a full afternoon shift because the fat in the peanut butter and the fat in the mayonnaise together delivered more sustained calories than most families realized they were getting purely from instinct and habit passed down without a single nutrition label anywhere in sight. Number 4. Cracklin' Sandwich Hog Butchering Day in Southern communities through the 1930s and 40s left behind pork skin, fried down crisp and salty in its own rendered fat until it crackled loud between your teeth, then piled hot onto a slice of bread straight from the pan. Nose to tail eating, decades before a restaurant menu ever used that exact phrase and charged extra for the privilege of saying it. Nothing from that hog went into the trash that day. Not the skin, not the fat, not the bones, not the organs, not a single scrap that could still feed somebody. Butchering day was hard, bloody, all-day work, and the cracklin' sandwich at the end of it was the reward for using every single part of an animal a family had raised themselves. Neighbors came together for it because no single family could manage a full hog alone in a single day, and the work was divided up by task. The men handling the killing and the cutting, the women rendering fat and salting meat for the smokehouse. That first hot sandwich, eaten standing up in the yard before the real work of preserving the rest even began, was the only reward anyone got that day, and it was more than enough. Number 3. Banana sandwich Southern working-class households through the 1940s and into the 1950s kept this one in regular rotation. A ripe banana, sliced thin, laid across white bread, spread edge to edge with mayonnaise. It sounds strange to a modern ear until you remember that a banana was one of the cheapest fruits a family could buy year-round by that point, shipped in steadily from Central America, and mayonnaise was the one condiment that made almost anything on a sandwich taste like it belonged there. Kids ate it after school without a second thought, the same way another generation would later reach for peanut butter and jelly. A cafe today will toast the bread, swap the mayonnaise out for tahini and a drizzle of honey, and sell the exact same idea for $9 as something entirely new. This was not a health food trend rediscovered. This was Tuesday's lunch, 60 years before it ever needed a hashtag to justify itself. A bunch of bananas cost only a handful of cents, even in a landlocked town, thanks to steady shipping routes from Central America that had been running for decades by that point, and a single bunch could stretch across a whole week of school lunches without a mother thinking twice about the cost. The bread went soft under the fruit by the time lunch period rolled around, and nobody minded that either. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Through the 1930s and again through the post-war years, the United States Department of Agriculture ran commodity surplus programs: cheese, canned meat, powdered milk, flour, distributed to qualifying families, often in plain government tins with no branding, no recipe card, and no instructions of any kind. It was left entirely up to the woman standing in that kitchen to figure out what to do with it. She turned government surplus cheese into pimento cheese. She turned canned meat into deviled ham and salmon loaf. She turned commodity flour into bread that fed a family for an entire week on almost nothing. Nobody wrote her name on a patent. Nobody put her recipe in a glossy cookbook with her photograph on the cover and her name in bold print. That is not a footnote in American food history. That is an entire generation of women inventing the dishes we still eat today out of a ration box and receiving no credit for any of it. Number 2. South Sandwich German and Polish immigrant butcher communities in the urban Midwest kept this one alive through the 1920s and on into the 1940s. Head cheese. The meat and gelatin from a hog's head cooked down slow for hours until it turned tender, then set firm in a loaf pan overnight, sliced thin the next day, and laid on dark rye with a sharp swipe of mustard cutting through the richness. It sounds like a delicacy to modern ears because, honestly, it is one, built with real technique and real patience by butchers who understood exactly what they were doing. Nose to tail eating, decades before that phrase existed in any cookbook, and no part of the animal wasted, not even the parts a modern grocery store won't even display behind the glass of the meat case anymore. They knew things about using an entire animal, start to finish, that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember how to do again. Butcher shops in those immigrant neighborhoods sold souse cheap, wrapped in wax paper straight from the case, because the technique to make it properly, clarifying the broth, seasoning it exactly right, setting it firm without letting it turn rubbery, took real skill that most home cooks respected but didn't attempt themselves. A sandwich of it on rye, sharp with mustard, was a small everyday luxury built entirely from a part of the animal most people today wouldn't even know how to ask a butcher for. Number 1. Scrapple Sandwich, Pennsylvania, Dutch country, from the 1930s through the 1950s. Cornmeal, pork scraps, and a careful mix of sage and black pepper simmered down together for hours and set firm in a loaf pan overnight in the cold pantry, then sliced thick and fried in its own fat the next morning until the outside went dark and crisp, and the inside stayed soft and almost creamy underneath. Laid hot between two slices of bread straight off the griddle, it was the meal that got a farm family through a full winter morning's work before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. Nothing on that farm was wasted going into that loaf pan, and nothing about eating it felt like settling for less. A restaurant today calls the same basic idea a pork terrine, slices it thin, and prices it like it just invented density and nourishment in a single loaf. It didn't invent anything. Grandma just called it breakfast, and it fed a family of 6 all the way to lunch. Making it took real patience. The pork had to simmer for hours until the meat fell apart on its own. The cornmeal stirred in slowly so it never went lumpy, and the whole mixture poured into loaf pans and left to set overnight in a cold cellar or an unheated back porch, because nothing about that process could be rushed. By morning it had firmed up enough to slice clean, and the first bite of that crisp, dark crust giving way to a soft center was worth every hour it took to get there. Closing fry the bologna. Grate the cheese for pimento cheese the exact way she did it, by feel, not by measuring cup. Slice that scrapple thick and let it go dark in the pan the way it's supposed to. These sandwiches weren't the food of people who had nothing. They were the food of people who wasted nothing, who took a can of surplus meat, a jar of pimentos, a hog nobody wanted to butcher all the way down to the skin, and turned it into something a family actually looked forward to eating. That is not poverty food. That is genius dressed down in a tin lunch pail so nobody would notice how smart it really was. And somewhere along the way, an industry that now makes a fortune selling you a $14 version of her tomato sandwich convinced you to be embarrassed by the original. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1956, a major food manufacturer launched an advertising campaign explicitly built around convincing American housewives that time spent cooking from scratch was time stolen from their families, reframing an entire skill set developed over generations and passed hand to hand from mother to daughter as a burden to be escaped rather than a craft to be proud of. The campaign worked. Within a decade, boxed and instant foods had displaced dishes like these on tables across the country, not because they tasted better and not because families had more money, but because an entire generation had been told, deliberately and repeatedly, that the alternative was something to be ashamed of. That is not convenience. That is a theft dressed up in a magazine ad, and it worked exactly as intended. Number two, chicken and rice. In the Mexican American communities of Texas and the Southwest, a single chicken, bought whole, nothing wasted, in the 1930s and 40s, became an entire Sunday. Simmered first for broth, the meat pulled and set aside, the broth then used to cook rice until every grain had gone golden and fragrant. The chicken returned to the pot at the end, so nothing dried out, nothing went to waste, nothing was cooked twice when once would do. One bird, properly handled, fed a table of 8 or more with room for the broth alone to become tomorrow's lunch. The rice carried flavor a plain side never could, because it had never been plain. It had been built, slowly, out of everything the chicken had to give before the chicken itself ever touched a plate. This was not a simple dish. This was efficiency raised to the level of instinct, a woman using every part of one animal across 2 meals without a recipe card, without a measuring cup, guided entirely by decades of watching her own mother do the same thing in the same kitchen, on the same kind of Sunday, for a family that never once went without. Number one. Sunday meatloaf with oatmeal filler, 20 cents of ground beef, in the urban industrial towns of the 1930s and 40s should not have fed a family of 6. It did, because Grandma doubled it, a cup of oatmeal, uncooked, folded straight into the meat, along with breadcrumbs and a single egg, absorbing the fat and the moisture as it baked, until the loaf came out the oven twice the size it went in, dense, sliceable, holding together on the plate the way a much larger, much more expensive loaf never could have without the same trick. Ketchup or a simple tomato glaze brushed across the top, caramelized dark in the last 20 minutes of baking. Sliced thick, served with mashed potatoes that mopped up whatever juices ran across the plate, this was the dish that came to define what Sunday dinner even meant for an entire generation of American families, who never had the money to call it anything grander. Today it's sold reheated, frozen, in a plastic tray for $9, smaller, denser, without the oatmeal, without the hands that shaped it, without a single person who understood why the trick worked in the first place. That is not meatloaf. That is the memory of meatloaf, sold back to us at 9 times the price and none of the skill. Closing 30 dishes. 30 women who never called themselves geniuses, who never wrote a cookbook, who never once thought what they were doing deserved a name beyond Sunday. They stretched a hen, doubled a meatloaf, turned a hog's head into something worth slicing thin. They fed families of 8 on money that wouldn't buy a sandwich today, and they did it every single week, without complaint, without a recipe card, guided by nothing but memory and necessity, and a refusal to let their families feel poor at their own table. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. It wasn't an accident that this knowledge disappeared. It was engineered, sold out of us one magazine ad, one supermarket redesign, one convenience campaign at a time, until a grandmother's instincts were replaced by a barcode. She was right. Everything she knew was right, and it took 2 generations and a mountain of processed food for anyone to start admitting it. That is not progress. That is a theft with a good marketing budget. Try one this week. Just one. Pick a hen, a hawk, a can of salmon, and see what your own kitchen can still remember how to do. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.